Hello and welcome to On the Right, a podcast that explores the personal and professional journeys of the world's most impactful leaders. We'll go behind the scenes to see how visionaries find their calling. I'm your host, Apoorv Agarwal, a serial entrepreneur and an AI scientist who spent the past decade building dream teams and commercializing AI. In each episode, we uncover the crucial decisions, risks, and revelations that have shaped these leaders, not just in their careers, but in their character. Today, I'm extremely excited to welcome Tim Mayopoulos. He's led some of the biggest financial institutions through the most turbulent times. I'm super excited. I think this is going to be a great conversation.
The reason why financial institutions fail is they run out of cash. Where there is big crisis going on also creates opportunity. This was like a great place to work, and people could not imagine that this had happened to the company.
Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's good to be past the dog days of summer.
Yeah, exactly. Tim, such an incredible career, right? And I feel like you're one of those few people who've literally been at the heart of some of the biggest disasters that have happened, at least in the past 2 decades, right? The 2008 crisis and then the SVB collapse. But I think there are very few people who've seen this level of leadership in moments of crisis. So I think that's going to be very interesting as well. You've been a leader at really large banks like Bank of America, but then you're president of Blend, which is a publicly traded company, but a much smaller financial institution. So would be excited to learn how does leadership, look at such a big institution versus a small one. So we'll, of course, chat about AI. But before getting into all of that, we'd just love to hear your story and your journey. What have been those key pivotal moments, key points of inflection in your life, which, if I may, made you on the right to be such an influential leader?
Well, thank you for all the kind words. It's very, very nice. I grew up in a blue-collar family. I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania and outside of Reading, which is a town that used to be a great industrial city and has been in decline for 100 years. And my family, my father was a union member, a union organizer. I think Walter Reuther was second only to Jesus Christ in our house, and Walter Reuther being the great union organizer and leader of the UAW. And so I came from a background where I didn't know any lawyers. I didn't know any business executives. I didn't know anything about the world of finance or law. And, as a kid, I was a very good student, but I was highly introverted. I was a really sort of bookish kid, and my siblings would tease me that they would have to come in and ask me multiple times to come out and actually play ball or something like that. So in addition to being an introvert, I was actually really very much of a perfectionist, and so I was very careful and deliberate about everything I did. And I remember my 4th grade teacher telling my mother that I would never amount to anything because I was just work too slowly.
Really?
And thankfully, I didn't learn about that till sometime later. But that's who I was as a kid, and so I think I thought I was intelligent and competent, but I didn't have a lot of, I wasn't a particularly outgoing or a person who was going to take command of situations. And so what changed over time? Well, I think, first thing is, I went off to school and, had good experiences there. But I think when I went to law school and then ended up practicing at an excellent law firm, a firm called Davis Polk, which is one of the leading Wall Street law firms in the world, I really became actually pretty good at what I did. And I started to realize that I could actually work with, really talented people at the very top of their professions. And I represented financial institutions and accountants and investment bankers and other lawyers and really helped them through extremely difficult things. Typically, I was not a deal lawyer. I wasn't a transaction lawyer. I was a litigator. And so I represented people in connection with very big lawsuits or regulatory investigations or sometimes even criminal investigations that affected people personally. And so I ended up in this sort of high stakes environment. And I realized that I had an ability to survey a scene, come to a conclusion about what the right path to success was, advocate for that, guide people through that. That and that people really would rely on that. And I essentially would help lead them through that process. So I think that was sort of the beginning of my leadership experience. And then over time, I sort of disciplined myself, forced myself to take on roles where I wasn't building on that core competency I had of knowing how to do these big ticket litigation matters, but instead try to do a variety of other things, some of which were unrelated legal things, and then over time unrelated business things, but really made a conscious decision that I needed to push myself into areas where I wasn't the most experienced or knowledgeable person about a particular subject, and I needed to force myself to go be a leader in contexts where other people were the experts, but I was the person who ultimately needed to make the decision.
I couldn't have guessed that you're an introvert. Like every time, we've met, I cannot tell. So do you feel like you grew being a child, being an introvert and super bookish, to being a litigator? Do you feel there was some transformation that happened?
I do think practicing law, which has certain performative elements to it, certainly gives one confidence that you can actually get beyond the way your brain works, but instead you can project a particular persona or image or perception of yourself. And it's not false, it's not fake. It's just that you become more confident in your ability to actually be yourself and say and do what you think are the right things to do. It's interesting. I think most people think that successful CEOs are all extroverts. And I think studies would show that that's really not true, and that some of the qualities of introverts actually help people be successful CEOs because they tend to be contemplative and they tend to be highly analytical. It's just a question of where do you get your energy from? I don't get my energy from going around and shaking people's hands. I get my energy from, sitting down and being thoughtful about things. And I enjoy dealing with people, but then there comes at the end of the day and I'm happy to go home and sit in solitude.
That is so interesting. I would say I'm a bit in your camp versus the camp of very extroverted CEOs. So I can fully appreciate what you're saying. Thinking about your leadership journey, would you say that you were a born leader, or this is something you grew into? Did it sort of happen organically, or you had to take some external coaching?
So, as you can tell from my description of my childhood, I don't think I was a born leader. I think that I had the qualities to become a leader, but I don't think that I sought to become a leader. I wasn't one of these people who organized groups of kids to go out and do things. I think my experience as a lawyer gave me confidence in my competency. I think that all good leaders are highly competent at something. That experience of being a master of something, being well above average at something, and really being able to lead through your mastery of a subject matter, I think is what gives a lot of eventual leaders that sense of confidence. I wouldn't say I was a born leader. I think I grew into it. I think I also got some really good advice along the way, where I think one of the best bits of professional advice I got is I was working for a senior partner at Davis Polk, and I came into his office one day and said, Jim, we have this big problem. Here's the problem. And he said, it's great that you have the mind to identify the problems, but every time you bring me a problem, or me or anybody else, you should also be coming with a solution.
Definitely.
And I may or may not accept your solution, but I want to know that you've thought about what the solution is. And I think for me, that was a pivotal moment where it was like, it's my job not just to understand the situation, but it's my job to actually figure out how to solve these problems, which is really the core of being a leader. Is how do you help guide people to successful resolutions of whatever it is that they're undertaking to do. So I think that for me, that was really important. And then over time, I took on bigger and bigger roles. As I mentioned earlier, I've quite intentionally in points in my career made a decision that I was going to step away from the litigation world. For example, I was the General Counsel of the Corporate Investment Bank at Deutsche Bank for the Americas. I intentionally stepped away from litigation and did only transactional and business-related work, even though that wasn't something that I had a deep expertise in. Many lawyers really enjoy being very deep experts in a relatively narrow part of the law. And those people make a lot of money and are very happy doing that. For me, what energized me was being able to be proficient, not necessarily expert, but proficient and well above average across a wide range of things. And so I intentionally put myself in these positions where I would do that. And then eventually, when I was asked to be the CEO of Fannie Mae, I had made a very conscious decision that I was going to step away from what was really a pretty successful career in the law and choose to become a business executive. And the path from there was very unclear. So I think you need to be willing to embrace a lot of uncertainty in your professional life if you actually want to be a leader.
Well, that's incredible. I mean, journey, starting from such humble beginnings and literally being, the top executive at some of the biggest firms. So that's fascinating. I want to talk about, one, how did you, like I said, who jumps on a sinking ship, right? Who volunteers to be like, oh, this thing is going down, and so I want to understand your thought process. What was going on when you decided to take the job as general counsel initially at Fannie Mae, and then eventually stepping up to be the CEO? And of course, Fannie Mae, I was looking at the numbers. They've just done incredibly well over the past year. So clearly you did an incredible job there. But I would love to just understand your thought process, your concerns. How were you evaluating this opportunity? I'm sure there were other opportunities, but you decided to take this one. So walk us through that.
Sure. So a little bit of context for people about Fannie Mae at the time. So Fannie Mae is the largest provider of mortgage credit in the United States. It doesn't make loans itself, but it buys mortgage loans in both the single family and multifamily mortgage space. And it does this at massive scale. It has a $3 trillion balance sheet. It's the world's largest financial institution by asset size.
Wow.
So
I didn't know that.
So, basically 1 in 3 mortgages in America is backed by Fannie Mae in one way or another. So in 2008, in the midst of the financial crisis, which of course was very focused on the housing space, Fannie Mae was in financial trouble, and the government put in a legal state known as conservatorship. So basically the government stepped up to back the company, took an enormous equity stake in it, and took control of the management of the company. And interestingly, a friend of mine at the time, as I was talking to him about various opportunities I had, he said, whatever you do, don't go to Fannie Mae.
Really?
That's a disaster. You do not want to be doing that.
Yeah.
And so obviously I didn't follow his advice. And, from my point of view, these situations where there is a big crisis going on also creates opportunity.
Yeah.
Creates personal opportunity, creates professional opportunity. And in a kind of strange way, I'm sort of drawn to these problems. I think it's my background as a lawyer who helped people through very difficult lawsuits or investigations or whatnot. But I'm kind of used to dealing with the company kinds of situations.
Wow.
And for me personally, I was really drawn to going to Fannie Mae because in 2008, going into 2009, the Center of Financial Services had really shifted to Washington, D.C. I mean, we'll all remember, the mortgage market was in free fall, housing prices were declining, foreclosures were up, unemployment was rising, terrible time for the country and for lots of people and their families. But to me, the center of the problem, of the opportunity to solve the problem was in Washington.
Yeah.
I had worked in 3 investment banks in New York, and New York seemed like the center of the financial universe. When I was at Bank of America, it's based in Charlotte. Charlotte seemed like an important center of the universe. By 2008, Washington, D.C. was the center of the universe. And so if you wanted to help solve that problem, that seemed like a great place to go. And since the crisis was a housing-oriented crisis, Fannie Mae is the biggest thing in housing finance in America.
Yep.
So if you wanted to go and solve a problem, at least that was a place where you could actually go and make a difference. And for me personally, it was a chance to show I can actually step up and do something that's difficult and challenging. And I didn't go to Fannie Mae with the idea that I would be anything other than lawyer. Actually, when I went to Fannie Mae, I was recruited to see if I would come for 12 at most 18 months.
I see.
The CEO and the chairman of the board had come out of retirement to take over Fannie Mae, and they said, well, you need to think about this as a period of public service. Just do this for a year and a half at most. And if you want to stay on later than that, you can. There'll be opportunities, but if you don't, that's fine. This is what we need you to do. And so I ended up spending almost 10 years at Fannie Mae. I never went there with that as my plan. I never thought that, from being the general counsel, I became the chief administrative officer. And then a year and a half after that, I became the chief executive officer. That was a trajectory that, frankly, I could not have seen at the time I joined. But it was precisely because the situation was so challenging and difficult and fluid that it opened those professional opportunities in a way that, frankly, just wouldn't have happened at a high-functioning, steady Eddie big company.
Sure. And it's interesting because lawyers are associated with being risk averse, but here you are actually taking, making the riskiest bet for opportunities. And
I do think that most people who would encounter me in day-to-day life wouldn't think this, but I actually do think I'm a risk taker. I like to think I'm an intelligent risk taker.
Yeah.
I make calculated bets, but I definitely have a risk tolerance that I think is different than many other lawyers, which I think is one of the things that's helped me transition from being a lawyer to also hopefully being a good business executive and being involved with startup companies and working with founders who are, by definition, this, you are one of these people, they are big risk takers. And I think some people are surprised that I've been able to navigate the world of big, highly regulated financial institutions and a history of being a Wall Street lawyer to now really spending most of my time in the venture capital backed world. And I find the risk-taking element of founders and of small companies to be really quite stimulating.
Yeah, I know 100%. And coming back to your time at Fannie Mae, leading these roles, but I'm very curious to hear about some of the leadership lessons there, or even just how was the environment at Fannie Mae? Because of course, many people lost their jobs and families were impacted.
The state of the employee base at Fannie Mae when I got there was terrible. This was a very proud company. Especially in Washington, D.C., where many people work for the government, this was like a great place to work. And people were very proud of it. It was a company was always associated with homeownership, a fundamental American ideal. And people could not imagine that this had happened to the company. And so morale was quite low. Well over half the executive team was fired. And I was part of a new team that came in. The company was losing massive amounts of money, like tens of billions of dollars a quarter. Like most companies can't lose that much money and not, and survive. The only reason we were able to survive is because Fannie is so central to the housing finance system in the United States that the government stepped in and propped the company up and propped up its sister company, Freddie Mac. So, but morale was terrible and people were really struggling. And it wasn't just what was happening internally, it was also what was happening externally. Like people got rid of all their Fannie Mae paraphernalia. Like they wouldn't wear a Fannie Mae baseball cap.
Really?
They wouldn't wear a Fannie Mae t-shirt. I remember at one point people coming to me and saying, can we get new parking stickers for the parking lot because they say Fannie Mae on them? And some people are getting their cars keyed by
Oh my
people
God.
because the public narrative was that Fannie Mae had caused the financial crisis,
Sure.
which was not true.
Not true,
right? It had a role to play in the housing finance system. And if you want, we could talk about what my own views are of what
Sure.
caused the problem. But there was a lot of anger, a lot of rage, and people felt personally at risk. I remember, people worried about, their personal safety at the office. And so it was a really, really difficult environment. So, what were the leadership lessons of that? One is like, just show up and be empathetic.
Yeah.
Like, accept the fact that people are going through this pain. And it wasn't just the emotional pain. It was also a lot of financial pain. Like people had been paid in stock options and equity, and that was all wiped out. So for people, this was not just an emotional challenge. This was also a financial challenge for them. And no one really knew what the future of the company was going to be, whether it was just going to be put out of existence. So first thing is like show up, be empathetic, try to understand where people are coming from, try to meet them where they are. Second is I think you have to give people some sense of purpose in that moment that isn't focused on the loss of the past, but the opportunity for the future. So for us, even though at the time the then administration was talking about like winding down the government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie and Freddie, and we all assumed that meant like these companies would go out of existence, my framing for people was, if that happens, given what a big role Fannie and Freddie play in the system, that's not going to happen overnight. Like that's a multi-year journey at best. And what we should be focused on is, how do we help solve the immediate crisis? How do we keep people in their homes? How do we, preserve communities? And how do we allow people to avoid foreclosure? And in the short term, and then the longer term, how do we build the foundation for a better housing finance system going forward? So I don't think we should be pushing homeownership as a good for everybody in the country. It's appropriate for many people, and I think it's a quite valuable thing. For most Americans over the last century, homeownership has been the only leveraged investment they can make, and it has generated a lot of family wealth. And I don't mean like millions of dollars. I just mean like the difference between having $50,000 or $100,000 or not. But for most families, like that's an enormous amount of wealth that they wouldn't have if they rented their whole lives. Now, some people would say, well, people who rent, they should just take their money and invest it in the stock market. The reality is people don't have that kind of discretionary investment capital. And even if they do, they probably won't be disciplined enough to put it into those investments. And if they can buy a home, and they can do that with a certain amount of financial confidence, owning a home isn't for many people, and I've seen this in my own family, it's kind of a forced savings plan. You're paying for your shelter at the same time you're building equity in something. And if you've put down 10% or 20% on a home, you get all the appreciation on 100% of that home, even though you've only invested 10 or 20% of it. So like for those of us who live in the financial world, like, yeah, it's great to go be in some fund where you can get a lot of leverage and invest in private equity or something else. For the typical American family, that's not available to them. This is the only leveraged investment they can make. And so I think from a financial point of view, it works for many, many people. I'm always struck that the people who argue that people should not own homes almost always own their own homes.
Yeah.
Like they own their own homes.
For sure.
And, as a society, we've created a lot of government support for this, including tax benefits and whatnot.
I was talking to the younger generation now. I was teaching at Columbia and talking to students and talking to them about housing markets and mortgages. It's very interesting. I mean, they're like, housing prices have gone so high that they do not see a future where they can actually go own a home. And this has been the American dream, so to speak. And so my question to you is, since you understand mortgages and these markets better than anyone else on the planet, like, is the American dream over? Do you think, like, how do you think people being able to own homes in the future, especially the younger generation?
So this is a serious challenge. First I'd say, like, we spend a lot of time in the public discourse talking about like how to lower interest rates. Look, the challenge in the current market is that not only are home prices high, but the cost of financing a home has also increased substantially. So the combination of those two things makes this extraordinarily difficult. But there's been a lot of talk about we just need to drive interest rates down. Well, you know what? When you drive interest rates down, what happens is that asset prices increase because it attracts more interest in that market. And that's what fundamentally has happened over the last 30 years, is that certainly over the years leading up to the financial crisis, and then in the period after the financial crisis where interest rates were extremely low, asset prices, home prices appreciated well above the rate of inflation. What we need to do as a country is we need to think about housing as part of the core infrastructure of our society. Just like we think about airports and railroads and highways and all that stuff, like the only way we're going to have successful, prosperous communities and happy and healthy families is to give people housing that they can afford. And that requires us to build a lot more housing. We just need more housing. And the reality is that for many years now, the United States has failed to produce enough housing to compensate for population growth and for the number of units of housing that just go out of the market because they're no longer viable.
Yeah.
So that's what we need to do. I wish that our government, and I don't say this in a partisan way, this has been true in both Democratic and Republican administrations, just put more emphasis on how do we create enough good, affordable housing for people throughout the country, in cities, in suburban areas, in rural areas. The country is experiencing a housing crisis, and it's a complicated problem to solve. I don't mean to suggest that it's easy, but there's a role for government to play at both the federal level and the state and local level, but we need to address that problem. And so I think anything we can do to produce more housing, whether that's by reducing regulation, encouraging people to go into the trades so they can actually build the housing, loosening zoning standards, simple things like building codes.
Yeah.
Like every year, we make building codes stricter, which is all good from a kind of safety perspective, but that all comes at a cost. So we just need to calibrate all those things and create an environment where we can actually produce more housing.
Interesting. So you feel actually the government has an important role to play here, and anything they can do to increase the supply of housing, that would be kind of at the heart of it, the core solution.
It was an interesting experience at Fannie Mae where, certainly on the single family side of things, we had no role in increasing the production of housing. We had a big role in the financing of existing housing, but we didn't create new housing. On the multifamily side, we could actually make capital available for developers to build new apartment buildings, which is highly efficient in lots of different ways. But fundamentally, as a country, we've never had not since the days of the end of the Second World War, where we created immense amounts of housing. Not since those days has the United States really focused on how do we actually just increase the production of affordable housing.
Interesting.
At scale.
So interesting. Very interesting. So I'm curious. So when SVB, went down, FDIC picked you to come. You're the guy, who comes and fixes things. So they picked you. You became the CEO of SVB and walked them through a successful acquisition. Were there any similarities in the two situations, especially coming back to leadership lessons? Were there any lessons you learned at Fannie Mae that you could reuse in the SVB situation, or what were some of the new leadership lessons you learned, working on the second crisis?
Another very proud institution with a lot of really talented people who are immensely surprised that their institution had failed in the matter of really 36 hours because there was a run on the bank that was stimulated by concerns about whether it had sufficient capital and liquidity. And so the FDIC called me on a Sunday morning to see whether I'd be willing to get to California that evening. I was at my place in Chicago, and SVB is based in California. And they called me at 8 a.m. and said, we actually have two institutions that have failed. There was SVB and Signature here in New York, and another that might fail in First Republic. We're looking for people to help us manage these institutions. And in the case of SVB, they decided to create a bridge bank. They did this at Signature too. They didn't have to do this at First Republic in the end, but basically it's like taking the assets of the old institution, which has failed, putting them in a new bridge bank and operating that bank for as long as it takes to get to a successful resolution. They said, we'd like you to do this. You can have your pick of where you want to go. And I said, I want to go to SVB because I really care about the venture capital community and founders and the kinds of customers that SVB was so successful at serving. And they said, great. So I said, can you get me on an airplane, buy me an airplane ticket out to California, which they did. And I ended up in a middle seat in coach on the last flight from Chicago to last flight to San Francisco, and then took a car down. And I had the wrong address, and then eventually got to the right address and showed up the next morning to open up the bank. So obviously no time to really study the institution. I knew a little bit about SVB, but had no deep knowledge of it. And I understood like my job here was to just stabilize the situation. And in my experience, my point about empathy at Fannie Mae also applies here. Like just being able to show up, people knew that I had had experience in some of these difficult kinds of situations before. The CEO and the CFO had been walked out of the building the previous Friday. I'm showing up on Monday morning.
Yeah.
I think they were appreciative that somebody was going to show up and be in charge.
Yeah.
Like somebody who could just make decisions and move forward.
Sure.
And I showed up and said, look, I cannot imagine what's going through your heads. Again, people have lost immense amounts of personal wealth as a result of this. No one knew what was going to ultimately happen to SVB, but they knew they weren't going to get their stock back.
Yeah.
And they knew that the institution they had worked for and were very proud of was likely to cease to exist one way or another, either through acquisition or by being dissolved. So one way or another, that was likely to happen. I said, but as professionals, like there are all these people who work for you. These are the people who have worked for you for years. And these are people who respect you. And they're going to take all their signal from you.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to take it from me. They're going to take it from you.
Yeah.
You have to make a decision about whether you're willing to kind of step up and lead those people who are going through the same kind of personal and professional crisis that you are and provide them with some sense of purpose and mission and focus until we get this resolved. Or not. But we're all going to be judged professionally on how we respond to this crisis for however long it takes, whether it's days or weeks or months. And all of those people stepped up and did that. Again, it's about this point about like creating a sense of purpose. And for the people at SVB, the purpose was serving their customers. It was a highly customer-centric organization, but they were very motivated to take care of the people who worked for them and to take care of the people that they had been serving as customers. And so it's all about like finding this sense of purpose for people and getting them focused again on that in the wake of the crisis.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That you decide to take on the role without knowing much about the bank, without knowing what the culture was, without knowing what sort of environment you'll step into. That's fascinating. But then sounds like in these situations, of course, lead with empathy, but then give people a sense of purpose. There was a lot of focus on professional development or how they could grow as professionals and turning that around and converting that into more of an opportunity versus a drag, right?
Right. And that can only last for so long.
Sure.
You can't ask people to stick around for 2 years doing that and only that. But that was, I think, these people were highly professional and they were motivated by the right things. Like the reality of being a CEO is that you make decisions that no one else can make or that no one else will make.
Yeah.
If they could make them or they were willing to make them, they would have made them.
Yeah.
Like you know this, you've been the CEO of a company, and it's really valuable in any organization to have someone who's willing and able to do that. And so from the first hour I was there are people showing up and saying, we need to decide, should we do this or should we do that? And you listen to them for 5 minutes, you say, go do this, don't do that.
Yeah.
And obviously you're hoping to make the correct decision, but in some ways it's just important that someone's making a decision.
Definitely.
Just move it forward. Like,
Exactly.
Don't be a bottleneck.
Exactly.
Make things happen.
Completely agree. And I've, heard Dan Cooperman, another common friend, he tells us a lot of stories about Steve Jobs. And that's one of the things he actually mentions about Steve. He always made quick decisions. Now, time will tell if they were good or bad. But the reason why he was so effective was that he actually made decisions and, got you from point A to B.
I think that's right. I think the other thing that's important to remember about
Yeah.
making decisions that are good or bad is that the outcome doesn't tell you whether it was a good decision or a bad decision. You can make an excellent decision, and the outcome isn't what you hoped or expected it would be.
Interesting.
The question is, did you pay attention to the right inputs? Did you weigh them appropriately?
Mm-hmm.
And then once you've made that decision, it doesn't mean that the fact that it was a good decision will actually produce the outcome you hoped or expected. And so you shouldn't question whether it was a good decision. What you should be doing is saying, did I really think about the right things and weigh them appropriately and do it at the right velocity in order to be able to move the organization forward? But I do think people have this tendency to confuse outcomes with quality of decision making.
Yeah.
you can make a very good decision and end up with a bad outcome. By the same token, you can make a really bad decision and still end up with an okay outcome just through luck.
Wow, that's interesting. And I didn't think of decision making in that way, actually. Do you have a specific example of, or in your career or otherwise, a good decision you made, but then the outcome was still bad?
I'm sure, because I have had plenty of bad outcomes. So,
Followed by good outcomes or great outcomes. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that the key is to, once you end up with a bad outcome, or you see you're on a trajectory to get a bad outcome, is being able to make a pivot to take account of circumstances that you either didn't anticipate or you could not have anticipated.
Sure.
For example, like, we're living in an environment where lots of people made great decisions about how to run their businesses the day before COVID hit, and then COVID hit.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And all of their decisions turned out to be unfortunate decisions because the world changed in a dramatic way.
Sure.
But there's no reason why they should have anticipated
Makes sense.
a worldwide pandemic. So sometimes stuff happens, but if a week after someone has identified that there is a pandemic and you still make that same decision, then that was a bad decision. Because then you actually had data that you should have been listening to and taking account of.
Yeah, definitely. Now, talking about decision making and velocity, let's pivot to your experience at Blend, which is a publicly traded financial institution, but much smaller in scale. I think they're like 150, 160 million yearly revenue run rate right now. So much smaller than a Bank of America or Fannie Mae, of course. But I think you're one of those unique people who've held leadership positions at such large institutions and at a much smaller institution. So you'd be able to appreciate what the differences are, in leadership style or what's needed and so on. So would love to hear about your leadership experience at Blend, especially being, the president, helping the company go public. What are the differences you see? What are the lessons learned there?
So Blend is a technology company. It's a software company. It provides financial institutions with software to engage in various kinds of consumer finance transactions, from mortgage to personal loans to credit cards, whatnot. And it's been actually quite successful. It has, I think, quite a big percentage of some of the largest financial institutions in the country use Blend software. But I'd say that the cultural environment is completely different than it is at a big institution like a Bank of America. I mean, when I was at Bank of America, we made a little less than $20 billion a year net income after taxes. We probably had 250,000 employees. And it was like a massive, not only national, but international franchise. Blend, when I got there, had been through its Series C round, venture capital backed. Maybe we had 100 employees, and our goal was to scale this. And this was in a period in the market where software companies were being rewarded quite generously for growth, and so we were looking to grow the business. We had a debate about whether we should actually want to go public or not, and decided that we would go public, and did. And then the world changed on us, and a big part of Blend's revenues come from mortgage origination, and mortgage origination declined markedly thereafter, and multiples on tech companies contracted a lot. And so we went through a lot of challenges. Like, we went through this great ramp up to going public, and it was a lot of fun to stand on the balcony at the New York Stock Exchange and ring the bell. And then we went through a lot of challenges. So what I'd say is, like, the difference between operating in a much smaller place than the bigger place is that the need to make decisions and to do it quickly is so much greater. First, it is difficult to make a decision that's going to have a big impact on the organization. It's just massive.
Yeah.
Right? So I think one of the challenges for executives and employees in those places is, like, why should I do anything that's particularly remarkable? Because I can't ever have a material impact on the trajectory of this company.
Yeah.
Whereas, as you know, being a founder is like the decisions that you make every day, and that everybody in the organization is making every day, can have a huge impact on the trajectory of the company.
Yeah.
So culturally, I think you need to get much closer to the decision making. You need to like do it much faster. You have to help people make good decisions, not necessarily ones that produce consistently great outcomes. Hopefully they do, but
Yeah.
but make good decisions. And when things don't go as you hope they will, be able to make adjustments and make another set of decisions that will get you moving in the right direction. Bank of America, I'm not saying it is being run this way. I'm just using it like pick any big company.
Yeah.
Like somebody could manage it not that well and it will be fine for a long time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It may not be as successful as it could be, but it could be fine for a long time.
Yeah.
That's not true in the context of a company like Blend or other early stage or startup or smaller companies. And so you have to be much more aware of the fact that you have less room for error. You have less of a cushion to rely on. And so every decision you make, you need to make well and you need to make quickly in order to be able to keep moving forward.
Yeah. Which is, makes things like you're having to make more decisions at a higher velocity and the margin of error is lower. And on top of that, there's a lot of visibility. I bet like making decisions at a big organization, I know people make committee decisions. So it's not like, they'll build a big committee. It takes a long time, but no one wants to take the risk of, sticking the neck out. But however, there's no time for committee decisions in a smaller organization, I would think.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's a lot more consensus
Yeah.
driven decision making in large organizations. And some of that's by design. Like they are structured to be able to drive checks and balances and consensus driven decision making. But that makes them less bold.
Yeah.
They're looking to like consistently, be successful, but the rewards, the risk reward profile is very different.
Yeah.
Like, as you know, if you're a founder or an employee in an early stage company, if it works out, like the reward is great. But if it doesn't work out, you're all just going to go home with nothing. And that's not the way people think in big companies. That's not the risk reward ratio they're signing up for. So I think there's obviously overlap between people who work in big companies and people who work in smaller and startup companies. But I think prototypically, they're just different profiles of people and what they like to do, what they're comfortable doing, and coming back to something we talked about a little bit earlier, like my own sense of myself as a risk taker, despite the fact that I've been a lawyer and an executive in big financial institutions, I think there's a part of me that enjoys the risk-taking aspects of small companies.
Yeah. So Tim, let's pivot a little and talk about AI. How can we not talk about AI? So let's just start with, what does AI mean to you? When you hear the word or phrase artificial intelligence, what goes through your mind, and how do you kind of think of it, the larger picture?
Sure. So as you know, I'm not a technical person. Like I don't have a PhD in computer science, so I'm not able to like think about all the technical aspects of it in a way like you could. But the way I think about AI is like, this is like analogous to electricity. Like if you think about, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where electricity became prevalent, where you could literally, instead of relying on steam engines or horses, like you could plug something plug into a socket in a wall, and you would have power. Like I think AI has at least that level of impact going forward, and probably even greater. So I think this is like going to be a revolutionary event, and that's not a particularly, precious insight on my part, but I do think that it is, that for a while there was people have this idea that this is sort of a fad. And obviously when you look at the amount of investment in it and the valuations of some of the early startup companies, maybe that's all highly speculative. But in the same way that investing in early electricity related activities was also speculative, over the coming years, like this is going to change the world in an incredible way. I think about all of the scientific advances it will produce, but I also worry about what it will mean in terms of potential underemployment or unemployment, because I do think artificial intelligence over time will replace a lot of jobs, including lots of knowledge worker jobs. People that I have spent my career with, lawyers and bankers and advisors and consultants. And there's no doubt that that will happen. I do think it's possible like the senior people in those professions will be fine because they bring a sense of perspective and wisdom that maybe AI can't deliver. The challenge is going to be like, how do you train the next generation of lawyers and bankers and consultants and advisors? Because the way we all developed that pattern recognition, the way we all came to have that perspective was being down in the trenches and I'm not sure the trenches are going to be there for people to work in.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the way, I look at it, it's not the first time a technological revolution has happened. Of course, when calculators came out, everyone thought, oh, in fact, people who were doing manual calculations, they thought they'll be now out of job. When ATM machines came out, bank tellers were like, they're going to be out of a job. Of course, the number of bank tellers have only grown over time. Their role has changed from just exchanging cash to actually doing more, building relationships with customers and being, more empathetic, actually being more human.
Right.
and in
Doing
some
something
sense.
the ATM cannot do.
Exactly.
I don't know. I mean, as you point out, like typically what's happened in the past, this has happened very consistently. These new technological innovations have been incorporated and it causes some short-term displacement of people from jobs, one kind of job into a different kind of job. So, 100 years ago or 150 years ago, America was an agrarian society and the development of machinery and mass production moved people off of farms and into cities and away from agriculture into manufacturing production. That didn't work out well for everybody involved because some of those farmers couldn't make that transition. But as a society, it actually generated wealth. It created productivity. It created convenience for people, and people's lives got better. I think the $64,000 question is like, is AI going to be like that, like every other technological revolution in the past? Or is it going to be so massive that it will be able to replace the work of a significant portion of humanity? And I don't know the answer to that question. As Yogi Berra has once said, predictions are very difficult things to make accurately, especially those about the future. One of my brothers was a truck driver for many years, drove trucks for Walmart. He's now retired, but he was like in the last 10 years of his career, he's like, I know that this job is not going to exist for the next generation of people because they're going to be self-driving autonomous vehicles, and maybe they'll pay somebody to sit in the cab in the case of an emergency or to do something, but they're not going to pay somebody what they pay them to actually drive this vehicle and be responsible for it. So I think there's a lot of angst in Western civilization about how secure are anybody's jobs. I mean, I have 2 children of my own and I have 2 stepchildren. I find it incredibly difficult to advise them on how they should prepare for their careers. I mean, given health outcomes, God willing, they'll live to be well over 100 years old. It's a very uncertain world, I think, for lots of people.
Yeah, definitely. Are you ready for some rapid fire questions?
I guess I'm as ready as I'm going to be.
What's one misconception people have about SVB?
I think it was that people thought that SVB had an inherently risky business model because it served, startup companies that by their nature carry more risk than the kind of big companies we spent some time talking about. SVB's business model actually was quite good. What they failed at was kind of one of the fundamental things about banking, which is make sure that you have sufficient capital and make sure you pay attention to your liquidity. The reason why financial institutions fail is they run out of cash. And that's what happened to SVB.
One thing you would not put on LinkedIn, but people should know about you.
I don't know if they should know it about me, but one thing to know about me is like I'm a person who really enjoys like design and art and architecture. When I was a kid, I used to dream about being an architect. And when the newspaper came around, there was a little section of the Sunday paper where they would have floor plans of houses. And I used to love looking at those. So that's something I think most people probably don't know about me.
So fun. What would you say is the most underrated quality of a great leader?
Humility.
Mhm.
I think most people think great leaders ought to have enormous amounts of competence. I think the best leaders have a lot of humility and surround themselves with other really smart, capable people and listen to them.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Who's a mentor who's influenced you the most?
I've had the good fortune of being influenced by a lot of people, really talented people. But one person who sticks out for me is a guy named Walter Dellinger, who unfortunately has passed away. But Walter was one of the great constitutional lawyers in the United States, and I hired Walter to work on some matters for me over the years, and we ended up becoming very good friends. And the thing about Walter that differentiated him was like he wasn't just intelligent, he was wise. And there's a difference between being intelligent and having wisdom. And I would call Walter about things that he was not expert in at all, but I knew that he would be wise in advising me how to think about it.
Mhm.
And so I aspire to be a wise person. I aspire to be a wise person like Walter Dellinger.
Definitely. What's the riskiest bet you've ever made?
I would say probably the best bet, but also the riskiest bet I made was on myself. I moved after I graduated from college, I moved to New York City, to Manhattan, which I had never been to before, with less than $500 in my pocket, and borrowed more money than my parents had paid for their house to finance my law school education. And that was a big bet. It had to work out. Like if it didn't, I was going to be spending the rest of my life paying off student loans without a whole lot of money. And that was a big bet, but I think most people do well to bet on themselves.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. With that thought, Tim, I really want to thank you for your time today. This was such a wonderful conversation. I had no idea you came from such humble beginnings, and of course, I knew your journey, rise as a leader, and helping such big financial institutions in times of turmoil and when they really needed help. But yeah, today's conversation was wonderful. Learned a lot about just leadership at large, but leadership in crisis situations, and then leadership at a big bank versus smaller institutions, and many other things. So thank you so much for your time, and really appreciate all the insights.
Well, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to visit with you and with your audience. Thanks.
Of course. Thanks, Tim.
Take care.